Hey, Darwin's hamster. Thanks for that video response. First, I want to talk a little bit about evolution. I'm reading chapter 3 of The Origin of Species right now, and then I'm going to try to relate that to the question you asked at the end of your video about whether or not human beings were more barbaric before they were civilized or after they were civilized. So I'm going to quote this few lines that I thought was really interesting, if I can find it. Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult at least, I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. Yet unless it be thoroughly ingrained in the mind, I am convinced that the whole economy of nature, with every fact on distribution, rarity, abundance, extinction, and variation, will be dimly seen or quite misunderstood. Now, what I thought was interesting was this phrase, economy of nature. Why would Darwin call it an economy of nature? And I think because, like I mentioned in my last video, he has an economic metaphor based on his existence as a human being in a capitalistic marketplace, and he's using that to understand nature. And instead of thinking of nature as an ecology of interconnected organisms, he's thinking of nature as individual organisms struggling against one another to survive. And both of these metaphors are valid. The ecosystem metaphor and the economy metaphor, they're valid in their own way. The question is the economy metaphor somehow more basic or more fundamental than the ecology metaphor? And I would say no, no way, of course not. The ecology metaphor, if anything, is more basic because at a greater scale, individual organisms are um, all part of this biosphere. They're all living organisms that have always been eating each other, that have always been living off the wastes of other organisms to survive, that have been interacting and um, getting intertangled with other organisms in these complex niches that allow them to survive in ways that a human engineer, would be hard pressed to ever discover, or to build. It just sort of happens on accident, which is the glory, the most amazing part of evolution. That there's all these accidental adaptations that end up being amazingly um, useful and efficient ways of surviving. Um, so I like the ecology metaphor better because at the level of ecology, you can see that there's one greater organism that's not struggling with anything to survive. It's more of this dynamic of um, interconnected dancing, maybe I guess you could say, where yes, individual organisms are eaten by other individual organisms, and the organisms that are more um, or better adapted to their environment will survive. But then there's another picture you have to consider also is that the organisms change the environment. So it's not as though the organisms are the passive victims of the selection of the environment. The organisms can select the environment as well. Like beavers can dam rivers and change the ecosystem for 100 miles. You know, down that river. Um, the first bacteria to come alive on planet Earth is responsible for our atmosphere. It created the carbon dioxide, which allowed plants to start to flourish, which created the oxygen, which allowed mammals to start to flourish. And so organisms are as much selecting the environment as the environment is selecting organisms. So I think if we look these words, ecology and economy, up, we'll get a better understanding of how they differ from one another. So economy is the system of production, distribution, and consumption. Economy is the efficient use of resources. Economy is frugality in the expenditure of money or resources. Economy is an act of economizing, reduction in cost. So a system of producing, distributing, and consuming wealth. Originally meant the management and regulation of the resources of the household. Um, the combined business and work done by a community, a mechanism that allocates scarce resources among competing uses. Okay, so we get the idea. Now, ecology, let's see what that means. Ecology, the study of how organisms interact with each other and their physical environment. The study of the relationship between living things and their environment. The study of the relationship between plants and animals and their environment. The science of the relationship between organisms and their environments. The interrelationships of living things to one another and to their environment. So, okay, it seems like the economy metaphor focuses on the differences, not the relationship, but the conflict, whereas the ecology focuses on the relationship. So economy, we might say, focuses on hate or survival of the fittest. I'm going to try to get a leg up on you because I am more important than you are, and you have that kind of a relation, that kind of a non-relationship. Whereas ecology, you have a more of an embracing, loving relationship where we share this natural environment with each other, and if we don't work out some mutually beneficial means of survival, then we're all going to go extinct. Now, I think what's interesting is to apply all of these theories to human beings, because we too are animals, and if evolution does proceed only by natural selection, then we have to apply that to human beings and see how it works out. If evolution is all about survival, the title of your video is our big brains. I think you did that on purpose, I guess, because the size of the human brain has no real evolutionary benefit as far as survival goes. We could have survived with a brain the size of our chimpanzee ancestors and been fine. But we developed a bigger brain, and alongside the bigger brain came this culture, which is, I mean, that's the main tool, the main metaphysical tool that this larger brain allowed human beings to develop. And I say metaphysical because, yeah, there's cultural artifacts, but there's also a cultural experience. There's also this experience of what it means to be a human that was somehow developed out of evolution. And what scares me about this natural selection stuff and survival of the fittest stuff is when scientists try to apply it to the cultural realm. So they take this biological theory of evolution by natural selection and survival of the fittest, and they try to stick it on top of our cultural world and say that memes are passed on based on their survivability and how well they allow the organisms that think that way, the human beings that think that way, to defeat and rise above the lesser peoples, the less culturally advanced peoples, say. And if we're going to be purely materialists, positivist scientists, that's the only place we could look for value or for ethics, is to biological evolution, because we're basically, from that view, we're just biological beings, and the culture isn't important. It's superfluous. It just rides atop the biological evolution, thinking it's in control, but really has nothing to do with anything. And I think that's dangerous, because then all of a sudden, if biology is our basis for moral values, eugenics becomes justifiable, genocide becomes justifiable, because if you are the supreme culture that at least to itself thinks it has the more survivable cultural memes than the lower or less cultured peoples, then you're very justified in killing them off. So that scares me. So I remember someone commented also about how people that have long-winded answers usually don't know what they're talking about, and that if you can give a short answer, you're generally showing that you know what you're talking about. And maybe that's true in some cases, but hopefully not in this case, because I didn't get to talk about this idea of whether or not human beings were more animalistic and violent and more barbarous before civilization or after. So I'm going to have to do another video to talk about that, which I'm sorry if you were really looking forward to my answer to that, because it seems like you're trying to trap me somehow, and I'm aware of that, and I'm going to try to answer appropriately in another video in a few minutes. So thanks for listening to this.